We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence. But not all men were treated equally in the United States during the early 1800s. Nearly 4 million of the 31 million people who lived in the United States were enslaved in the South. Compromises between the southern slave states and the northern free states had temporarily solved disputes between where slavery could and could not exist. With the westward expansion of the nation, slavery was once again disputed. Southern states knew that slavery must expand, otherwise they would face growing pressure from the North to abolish the institution altogether. These compromises and conflicts further divided the country in two, proving that a split nation of slave and non-slave states could not exist. Slavery of Africans in the southern states had a history dating back to the early colonization of the Americas. Slaves would be brought or captured in Africa and brought to the Americas by the Atlantic slave trade in cramped and crowded boats. Once in the United States, they would be sold like livestock to plantation and factory owners for use as cheap labor. The southern economy depended on these slaves to grow crops such as tobacco and cotton to be exported to the northern states and to France and Great Britain. With the expansion west, both slave and free states had come to a compromise over where slavery could and could not exist in the newly organized territories. This agreement was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The compromise prohibited slavery north of the 36th parallel, except in the state of Missouri, which would enter the Union as a slave state and would allow Maine to also join as a free state. Keeping the delicate balance of southern slave states and northern free states equal in Congress. In a letter to a Massachusetts representative, Thomas Jefferson commented that the settlement between the states would only further divide the country and lead it to its destruction. By the 1850s, the same disputes about where slavery could and could not exist was brought up again with the newly acquired land from Mexico. This led to whole new debates and discussions in the capital about whether to define where slavery could exist or to practice popular sovereignty and let the people choose for themselves. This led to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which undid the Missouri Compromise and left it up to the settlers of the territory to vote whether to become a slave state. The resulting violence between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery settlers caused many congressmen to accuse the South of helping the pro-slavery violence in Kansas. This caused Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina to physically attack Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, further widening the gap between North and South.
By 1854, the compromise itself was doomed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically stripped away the line. And Southerners wanted that very badly because it was a precedent that they wanted to erase from the books that Congress had banned slavery from any territory. They did not want that as a precedent, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act was designed not only to organize the territories, let the people decide whether slavery would exist or not, but they wanted to erase the precedent that Congress had anything to do with banning slavery anywhere.
By 1860, with several abolitionist rebellions and the election of Abraham Lincoln with his vow to stop the expansion of slavery, the South was in an uproar over their own state's rights to support slavery. By December of 1860, South Carolina had seceded from the Union, followed by 6 more states before February of 1861. They took control of federal forts and other properties within their borders. They had little resistance from outgoing President James Buchanan, whose term ended on March 4th of 1861. Buchanan asserted, "The South has no right to secede, but I have no power to prevent them." 1/4 of the U.S. Army, the entire garrison in Texas, was surrendered to state forces by its commanding general, who then joined the Confederacy. When Lincoln entered office in 1861, the 7 states of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas were in rebellion and had formed the Confederate States of America. On April 12th of 1861, after Union troops at Fort Sumter were fired upon and forced to surrender, Lincoln called on the governors of every state to send dispatchments totaling 75,000 troops to recapture forts, protect the capital, and to preserve the Union, which in his view still existed despite the actions of the seceding states. This was the start of the American Civil War. Virginia, which had repeatedly warned Lincoln that it would not allow an invasion of its territory or join an attack on another state, responded by seceding, along with North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. The slave states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware did not secede, and Lincoln urgently negotiated with the state leaders there, promising not to interfere with slavery in their states. Rather, he promoted a gradual emancipation by buying the slaves with federal money. Unfortunately, all of the states rejected Lincoln's offer. Lincoln knew that to end the war and save the Union, he would have to attack slavery itself in the South, and, as Commander-in-Chief, issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, going into effect on January 1st of 1863. It declared the freedom of all slaves held in territory that was in rebellion against the Union. This was directed at the now 11 states of the Confederacy. The proclamation represented a shift in the war objectives of the North. Reuniting the nation would no longer become the sole outcome. It represented a major step toward the ultimate abolition of slavery in the United States and a new birth of freedom.
And to Lincoln was much deeper too. When he started to think about the emancipation, this was about the Declaration of Independence and redefining what it meant to be free in American life and making the reality of American life consistent with our ideals. And he called the Declaration of Independence that electric cord that bound us to the founding and bound us all together, that we all believed in those things, and that we had two different definitions of what it meant to be free, and this war was going to decide that we were either going to be all one thing or all the other, one definition or the other. And he knew that this was not just about us, this was about what he called the last best hope of earth, that this was a test of the people's government.
The Emancipation Proclamation was widely attacked as it was freeing only the slaves over which the Union had no power, but in practice it committed the Union to ending slavery, which was controversial in the North. It was not a law passed by Congress, but a presidential order empowered, as Lincoln wrote, by his position as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, and by the end of the war, nearly 179,000 former slaves served in the Union Army. All slaves in the Confederacy were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, which applied only to slaves not in Union-held areas, in border states, or in Washington, D.C. Slaves in the border states and Union-controlled parts of the South were freed by state action or by the 13th Amendment, making slavery effectively gone in the U.S. in the spring of 1865.
Clearly that this is a war about that, about whether a government based upon those ideals can exist, and where the Civil War is testing that. But in the end, we'll have a new birth of freedom, and that's exactly what we did have. And he brought that about, and by bringing it to that point, it was not only a culmination of an achievement of what the founders had intended, but it was also the birth of a completely different union than it was before. And the next question then becomes not only what freedom is, but what does freedom mean in terms of equality? And that's the next question.
After General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln began drafts to establish black rights, but that was all cut short on April 15th of 1865, when John Wilkes Booth fired a shot into the back of Lincoln's head at Ford's Theater, leading to Lincoln's death the next morning. Many thought this was the end of the freeing of blacks in the South, but with the introduction of the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws, the fight was not over. It continued into the Civil Rights Movement with leaders like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. The fight, not just for freedom, but equality, was also one that could accept no compromise to lead people to true freedom in the United States.